Good morning, City of Carson. Hi, I'm Jody Marshall. I'm a licensed clinical professional counselor and a licensed clinical alcohol and drug counselor. And I'm here today to talk about grief, loss, self-harm, suicide, uh, particularly during the pandemic. And just speaking of the pandemic in general, that's something that most of us probably had never even considered that we would experience or even knew what it was. So I'll start there by talking about what pandemic is, which is an epidemic of an infectious disease that has spread across a large region. And for instance, multiple continents or the world, which that's definitely something that COVID did, is spread over the world, affecting a substantial amount of people. And when we talk about affected a substantial amount of people, we can also include infected and affected. And so ask yourself, is there anyone that you know that was not affected by that pandemic? We're still being affected by it. There are less people that are being infected, but still affected. And so even using those two words brings us to the correlation between physical health and overall mental health. When we talk about people that were infected with the disease, uh, that's a medical condition versus the fear and everything that comes with that. Um, and the degree of how we were affected varies, particularly loss. Um, whether it's a loss of jobs, homes, loved ones, uh, a sense of safety. I want to share my screen just to give you guys a visual, give your brain something to connect with, not so much just a dead screen or me, just something to, all right, as we load. And so understanding how the different losses, and when we talk about grief and loss, that loss is what leads to the grief. And we can grieve anything. You can grieve the loss of relationship, the loss of, as I said before, a job, a loss of your sense of safety. And particularly here with COVID, it was a loss of confidence, confidence in the system. And so when we look at grief, grief is described as sorrow, mourning, anguish, distress, agony, vexation, and imagine how those emotions will create more sadness and grief. Um, Looking at how all of these things lead to an overall regression of social and emotional competence, considering the isolation and things like that that we experienced during COVID, which led to, and I'll share a different screen, um, how we coping with the distance, coping with the losses, lead to those maladaptive patterns of coping, whether it's by using substances, self-harm behaviors. And self-harm behavior isn't even just what we think of with teenagers of cutting and things like that. Self-harm behaviors are things like um, shopping sprees and connecting with unhealthy relationships in those situations like that. Those can still be self-harm behaviors. Numbing, avoiding, and we can use those substances to help us numb and avoid. The isolation, and all of that leads to more irritability, more increased anxiety, and again, back to an overall regression in social and emotional well-being, which I think many of us have seen in a lot of ways. And so going back to how that connects to the uh, uh, emotional and physical of the pandemic. Um, One of the things that I noticed also during the pandemic when we talk about the increased anxiety is not just your typical anxiety, but uh, more agoraphobia and anxiety related disorders where people may not have even wanted to uh, leave the house. And so, giving us again, why do people get to that point of hmm, wanting to die or not wanting to be here anymore? The popular belief is that it's hopelessness and despair. And when we look at COVID during that period, there's a lot of hopelessness and despair. More than just typical hopelessness and despair, I want to bring in a term called ambiguous loss. So, ambiguous loss, I'll put on my glasses so I can read. Ambiguous loss is a loss that occurs without a significant likelihood of reaching emotional closure or an unclear understanding. Now, COVID-19, of course, was something that was very unclear. You know, when it started, we had no idea exactly what it was, how we'd be affected to the degree that we'd be affected, which creates that ambiguity. Now, this kind of loss leaves a person searching for closure, searching for answers, searching for uh, different ways to resolve. And thus it complicates or delays the grieving process and often results in what we call unresolved grief. Now, some examples in the real world of unresolved grief or complicated grief might be termination of a pregnancy, might be a family member that's missing, where I can't grieve that loss because I don't know what the outcome is, whether that person's going to come back, be found later, even something where a family member might still be alive, but they're in a state of cognitive decline and they may not remember you. And so that's even grieving the loss of that relationship or grieving the loss of health. And physical loss differs in terms of the type of grief, you know, loss of the physical body versus loss of psychological mind. And when we come to psychological, we're talking more of the ambiguity of it. And that can lead to certain questions, such as, am I still a parent to a child that's missing? And it's harder to cope and move on, as I was saying, because that loss is experienced. And so there are various types of grief that can be experienced with ambiguity and ambiguous loss. And COVID has extended that and created more of that. So let me give you another example. The stories that you hear during COVID where family members weren't able to attend the funerals, where they weren't able to even visit the hospitals during those situations when their loved ones were ill to support them. So that leads to, again, that ambiguous loss and delays the grieving process even more and gets back to some of those maladaptive patterns of coping. Again, give you guys a little bit share to break up just staring at me. Okay. Some of those maladaptive patterns, again, might be drugs, might be gambling, might be, and then when I say gambling, it's not just your typical gambling that you're at the casino, but these days you have your phones with you. So it's gambling on stocks, Bitcoin, it's the social media addictions, it's the shopping or pornography, but you have the access right here in your hand. And so that leads to more of the addiction and more loss, which creates that cycle of more grief and loss. But let's get to the positive coping. So if we say that despair and hopelessness leads to suicide, then it stands to reason that hope and purpose is good for coping and transitioning through. Positive coping, some of those activities, some of the stuff that you see on the screen might involve physical activity, moving your bodies. Of course, a sedentary lifestyle is probably one of the biggest things that lead to a decline in overall physical health and emotional health. When we consider early civilizations, we were made to move and be active. Intellectual growth, you know, whether that's learning something new, studying, learning how to cook, learning a new language, learning how to fix a car, something, anything that stimulates your brain and personal development. Focusing on faith and spiritual based practices. Of course, that's going to expand those neural pathways of positivity. Progressive relaxation, breathing awareness, one of my favorites, mindfulness. We do a lot with mindfulness, and I think there's another presenter that's discussing some of that here also in those presentations. But the overall goal of therapy to cope with ambiguous loss is to overcome the trauma associated with it and to restore resilience. Now, as we talk about it's the stages of grief and understanding what grief is, the stages from Kubler-Ross gives us understanding of the terrain and what to expect during that. The denial, the anger, the bargaining, the depression. And so that helps us understand what we may be going through. And as we talked about some of the ways to cope, that is what helps us progress through that. But also, there has to be a time for actually processing the grief. So if you're in a supportive environment and have a good support system and good coping skills, then the next stage really is to process. And one of the things that I like to do to help process that is a methodology called processing with the 5 W's. We have those questions: who, what, when, where, how, and why. And so it's a model to help understand, and again, to prompt thought about the loss and to verbalize and process those thoughts, those feelings, and those emotions. Why? Because grief may present with symptoms similar to depression, similar to trauma. And given the documented benefits of support, coping, and narration in a safe environment, then it stands to reason that processing grief in a person-centered narrative approach would lead to effective processing in most cases. So processing, that involves asking questions, prompting thought. Who was, let's say, Fido? If it's in the case of losing a dog, gives you the prompting the questions to speak about that. Many times we may not feel comfortable talking or even asking questions when people are experiencing grief. But again, if it's a safe environment, then you want to be able to ask questions like, what did Fido mean to you? And even if we're talking about other things, other losses, how about the job? What did being a teacher mean to you? As we're processing the loss, those questions, again, prompting thought to help me desensitize in some ways. Questions like, when did Fido leave? Understanding the stage of life, because there's a different grieving process if someone leaves when you're a child versus when you're later in life versus when they've lived a full life. Also, if there has been some notice where you've had a chance to prepare, then it's less ambiguous, as in if someone is diagnosed with cancer and you have a chance to prepare gradually for that versus a car accident, which is sudden. Where also makes a difference. Understanding where you were when you learned, that makes a difference, because again, as we think back and process back, even if I use 9/11, for instance, where were you when you heard of it? People go back and it prompts thoughts and memories. And that's the part sometimes that leads to the trauma. So if that gets unprocessed, again, those images that come in my mind that may be distressing can stop me from sleeping at night, keep me up. Let's get back to transition and then the slide a little bit. I want to use the term transition. And as I mentioned before, where were you when you learned Fido transition? And we'll say Fido, for instance. And the use of the word transition is intentional because consider that everything has to transition, and maybe transitioning from a physical form transitioning from one career to another career, transitioning from a lifestyle, transitioning from one environment to another environment, transitioning from singlehood to couplehood, to motherhood, to marriage, or even transitioning to a world without your loved one. And so it's important to decide how the relationship transitions, because there will still be a relationship in some form, whether it's a relationship with the memories, relationship with the pain, or relationship with the spirit of a loved one, and where that involves mourning annually on the day that person passed, or celebrating on their birthday, holding the guilt like a badge, because that's one of those stages of grief that sometimes may be hard to get through. And so also processing that, or creating a cause or activity that honors that person, or a particular ritual. Our relationship must transition, and that transition is part of the acceptance process and will help with that acceptance process. Questions like, why do you believe it happened? Helps us process. Deeper question, what do you believe happens when you die? Even your understanding or your belief of that makes a difference. I won't go deep into that, but consider what I believe happens when I'm gone, or what I believe happens to people when they go makes a difference in how I process that. So understanding that in your belief system. How will you honor their memory? And again, it could be planting a tree. It could be, in the case of a mother who loses her child in a car accident, becoming more purposeful and committing to Mothers Against Drunk Driving, or a cause, and understanding what that support system is also important. I think I'll begin to end with coping, as in understanding some of the positive experiences that you shared with that person and focusing on that. Many times we focus on how that person left instead of focusing on the positive experiences shared and come to mind, and being able to talk about those things. And gratitude, of course, living in the gratitude makes a huge difference. I'll share one more screen, give your brain something to contemplate, hopefully, as we navigate through this. How will you honor the memories? Let's say it's grieving the loss of something else, grieving the loss of a car. Will you get the next model? Grieving the loss of a relationship. Will that be keeping pictures? Will that be keeping letters? So again, as we consider grief as a stage that we all go through, it's important to consider how you choose to transition that relationship, and that there is still a form of a relationship. At this point, if it was a live presentation, I would be happy to open up for questions. But if not, it's been a pleasure. Thanks again, City of Carson. And if anyone, particularly the clinicians, would like more information on processing grief with the 5 Ws, feel free to send an email or reach out. Thank you.